so let's start the second video. So the second video is on CSQ 1. I'll be going through the CSQ, just giving you the answers and then explaining why the answers are like that. So the way you want to like do this, right, is just imagine like I'm teaching in class. So you just have foolscap beside you, and then you just foolscap or your tutorial beside you, and then you just copy down the answer onto your tutorial or foolscap lah. Okay, can, as well as my markings lah. Okay, so let's start with the first question. So the first question asks you to describe how real GDP in Singapore has changed from 2015 to 2021. So then they give you figure 1, right? So figure 1 has data from 2015 to 2021, so that's great. There's no need to chop off anything. And they ask you for Singapore's data, which is the blue color one. So on your worksheet you don't have color, so for you guys the one with the squares lah. Okay, can. Okay, so the first thing you'll notice is they ask for real GDP, right? But the very slide, so they gave you actually the percentage change, right? So the percentage change is not actually the real GDP. The percentage change is what happened to real GDP for the 2015 figure. It was how real GDP changed from 2014 to 15. And then for the 2016 figure, it was how GDP changed from 2015 to 2016. So each of these are actually percentage figures. So you can't just look at how the squares are trending, right? So you cannot say like, oh look, the squares are sort of going upwards like in this direction. That's wrong. So you need to interpret what the percentages mean first, and then figure out what happens with real GDP. Okay, so when you convert, this is a very, very common feature for macro, right? So for macro, right, they like to give you the percentage figures and then ask you to convert it into the actual levels, right? So in this case, the level of GDP lah, right? So you need to do some kind of processing, right? So how do you convert from percentage figures to levels? The first thing you got to realize is that if the percentage figures are positive, right, that means that the levels are increasing, which kind of makes sense, right? So for example, right, if you look at the if you look at the 2015 number, the 2015 number is about 3%. What this means, right, is that from 2014 to 2015, so if you plot, right, from 2014 to 2015, it is increasing at 3%, like so, right? And then from 2015 to 2016, it's about 4%, right? So for 2015 to 2016, it's slightly higher, it's 4%, right? And then from 2016 to 2017, it grew at about 5%, and so this is even steeper, right? So what you can see is that if the numbers are positive, that means that the variable itself must be increasing, which in our case is GDP lah, right? So if the numbers are positive, then the variable is generally increasing. And then so you can see, right, if you look at all the blue color squares here, most of the values are all above the zero line, right? And so if most of the values are above the zero line, then we can reasonably conclude that from 2015 and 2016 to 2021, GDP generally increased. Okay, again, it's not because the squares are generally trending upwards. It's not because of that, it's because the percentage figures are above zero. Okay, so that's the general trend. Okay, but then you will also notice that one particular year, which is 2020, I mean, guess what happened there, right? So in 2020, the number was negative, right? So if you plot, you keep going up, this orange colored line will keep going up until we hit 2020, then it did 4%, so then there's a dip, and then 2021 it went up 8%. Fantastic. That's so if you plot the general trend, what you realize is that generally it's increasing, but there's a dip here. So score 1 for general trend, score 2 for anomaly. Okay, So real GDP fell in 2020. Okay, again, not because the thing is the squares are trending downwards, but because for this pink color year, the number is negative. Okay, so again, if the percentage figures are positive, the variable itself is increasing. If the percentage figures are negative, like in the pink color diagram, a pink color year, the variable itself is decreasing. Okay, so that's the first data response question. Okay, second one. How do I close this? Oops. Okay, so second question asks you to assess whether the data provided in table 1, okay, this table 1, is sufficient to conclude that the US had a higher standard of living than Singapore in 2020. Okay, so this is a CSQ question. Let's get the easy stuff out of the way first. So a 10-mark CSQ question is 7 plus 3, right? So 3 would be your evaluation, which means you need to give a conclusion. Okay, then this is an assess whether question, which means you need 2 sides. So let's figure out, then the 2 sides will help you score the 7 lah, right? Okay, so let's figure out what the 2 sides are. So side 1, let's call it the thesis, or you can call it requirement 1, okay, whatever. So the thesis is that you need to show that the argument you need to make is that table 1 is sufficient to show the US standard of living is more awesome than Singapore's standard of living, right? It's asking you to prove, do you think that just by looking at our R5, it's sufficient to prove that this student is better than the other student? Something like that. Except your R5 here is just table 1, right? So do you think table 1, just by looking at table 1, you can prove this thing, right? So naturally, then your antithesis would be antithesis, or you can call it R1, R2, okay, however you want. Technically, CSQs there's no R1, R2, but just to align, it's fine. So antithesis, you're supposed to say, okay, table 1 is insufficient to show that US SOL is bigger than Singapore's SOL. Okay, so we need to make argument 1 first, which is table 1 is awesome, and then argument 2, there are some gaps in table 1 that you cannot show that standard of living in Singapore is higher than the standard of living in Singapore. Then standard of living in US is higher than standard of living in Singapore. Okay, so we make argument 1 first, we make argument 2, and then finally you end off with a conclusion. So that's how we're gonna move. Okay, and now I want to show you the technical terms in between. Okay, like what I mentioned, right? So you want to, as I show you the slide, you just pause and you just copy lah. Okay, I really would advise that because it really helps retention lah. Okay, it's one thing to take a screenshot, it's another thing to actually copy down and to retain something. Okay, so let's begin. Table 1 is awesome to show that US standard of living is higher than Singapore's standard of living. Okay, so what we're going to use, so you see table 1 here. Table 1 shows you how do you show that Singapore's US standard of living is higher than Singapore's standard of living. So first we start by defining what standard of living is. So standard of living has 2 aspects, right? There's a material component and then there's a non-material component. So your material component would be fulfilled by goods and services. Actually, the material component is very, very one-dimensional. So if I have 1 chocolate bar and you have 2 chocolate bars, your material standard of living is just higher than mine, just because of the fact that you have more goods and services. In our case, chocolate bars lah. So there are 2 aspects, right? So there's a material one and non-material one. So how do you gauge the material one? It's very easy actually. You just look at GDP per capita. Okay, so we spoke about GDP per capita in the previous video. It's basically the number of squares each person has, right? The number of chocolate bars each person have, but expressed in monetary terms. So you can see that actually US has 63,000 chocolate bars of dollars lah, worth of. They can buy $63,000 worth of goodies, right, in USD, right? And then in Singapore, that same number is 60,000 USD. Okay, so what does this mean, right? Obviously 63 is better than 60, but you gotta explain, right? So you say, okay, the data shows that the US has a higher GDP per capita, and then we quote the number here. Okay, so you make reference to the case. Then Singapore, poor Singapore only has 60,000, right? So then you explain what this value means. So you explain what this value is. Right, so the figure you have given me is the monetary value of all final goods and services produced within the geographical boundary of the economy. So I explained it last lesson. So within the geographical boundary, how many goods and services are you churning out? And then because it's per capita, we divide it by the total population. So it's a number of squares per person or number of dollars per person. Okay, so US has more squares per person than Singapore. Okay, you can pause and you can copy. Okay, then what does that mean? It means that if this number is bigger, the average income of the US is higher, which means this is a key term, that the purchasing power is higher. You must have this term. Okay, this is a technical term for standard of living. So if you have more purchasing power, it means that you can purchase more goods and services. I cannot stress this enough. You must have these two terms. These are technical terms for standard of living. Must have these two terms. Okay, so therefore the 63,000 suggests that material standard of living is higher in the US. Okay, so I use this. Okay, one thing I really want to stress, okay, in every table, right, all the examiners will try to give you like a whole host of different indicators. Okay, but if GDP is present, especially GDP per capita, you must use it. Okay, I don't care about all the others. They can give you all the other things which can act as indirect indicators of standard of living. If they give you GDP, you must use it. Okay, so just you can make a note to yourself. Okay, so now we've used GDP, so we've cleared that hurdle. What else does the table tell us? Okay, the other thing that the table tells us that's quite nice, no other, very rarely do they they give us this, but they gave us this. They gave us also the Gini coefficient. So we spoke about this indicator in income inequality, right? This is your L1R5. You want it to be as low as possible. And guess what? The US has a lower Gini coefficient compared to Singapore. So what does that mean? It means that you have lower income inequality, right? And this means that it is more evenly distributed. So in a society where not only do you have a higher GDP per capita, it is more evenly distributed, it is more likely that the average person has a higher income, and hence higher standard of living than in Singapore, right? Because it's less likely that all the income is going to one person. It's more likely that all the income is distributed more evenly. Okay, so these two are the material aspect, right? Then on the other hand, we also have a very weird indicator. We have this electric vehicle market share. So in Singapore, electric vehicles only take up 0.42% of the total vehicle market, whereas in the US, the number is like 5 times higher, which is 2.0%. Right? So 2.0, every 100 vehicles in the US, 2 cars are electric vehicles. So what does that suggest in a standard of living? So we spoke about the material one. So this first two is material, M. So now we can also say that the table is actually quite useful in telling us non-material stuff as well. So non-material stuff will be your living environment, things that have nothing to do with chocolate bars, right? So one aspect of non-material standard of living is the pollution. So if you are using a 2% EV, very likely there will be less carbon emissions. Less carbon emissions means a cleaner environment, which means better quality of life, which means better non-material standard of living. Okay, so just to cycle back. So our first part, the thesis, we have to say that table 1 is sufficient. It is awesome because firstly, table 1 shows us GDP per capita. right? And higher GDP per capita means higher purchasing power, more goods and services. These are technical terms, which means that it is sufficient to show higher material standard of living. Not only that, table 1 shows us the Gini coefficient, which means that the income is more distributed. And then finally, it shows us non-material aspects, which is the EV market concentration. So the EV market share. Okay, so table 1 is sufficient. Here's what I can use from table 1 to make that. And then by virtue of that, I will have shown that table 1 is sufficient. Okay, now we go to the next part. So table 1 is not sufficient. Okay, and so now we stand here. So what are some of the deficiencies in table 1? The first deficiency I'll talk about is it doesn't actually have other indicators, especially the other aspects of non-material, also the other aspects of standard of living. So for example, you'll read in your notes that life expectancies are very, very important indicators of standard of living, because if you have a higher life expectancy, it means better access to quality healthcare, and you lead a longer life that's likely to be free from illness. But obviously, this table doesn't show us that. Right? The table shows us very useful things, but it doesn't show us everything. And one thing that it doesn't show us is life expectancies. So what you're trying to do is trying to pick out gaps. So one gap is life expectancy. Right? Another aspect there is a gap that you can point out is non-material standard of living consists of many things. One thing is the living environment, which EVs have kind of taken care of. Right? But then there are also other things, like for example the number of working hours. Because if you work longer working hours, it means you have less leisure time, and you don't want to be working too long, right? Sometimes you also have very, very stressful lifestyles, which can lead to mental health problems. So without looking at these things, you cannot have a totally full picture about the country's non-material standard of living. So the first gap is I don't have life expectancy. Where's my life expectancy? And where's my working hours? So these are some deficiencies that you can write. Okay, so what's our conclusion? Actually, if you want to have a conclusion about standard of living, no way you're going to do that just by looking at these indicators. So what we're doing here, okay, so what we want to do is you signpost first, okay, and then give a stand. Okay, so my stand is that I don't think it's sufficient. Okay, why? Because actually, if you look at the numbers, right, these two are very close. I mean, it's a $3,000 difference, yes, but it's the whole year, right? Right, so it's 3,000 is actually a very, very small difference. I mean, if you talk about 60,000 versus 12,000, then sure, the 12,000 is definitely the loser. But between 63,000 and 60,000, actually, US only has a slightly higher GDP per capita. And then if you look at other indicators, like for example, the tertiary education attainment, you look at the Gini coefficient, they're all fairly comparable, right? So definitely, if I want to really come to a conclusion about which one has a higher standard of living, I really need more information. So what kind of information do I need? We pointed that out. We could have we can look at life expectancy, right? And I'm pretty sure that Singapore has higher life expectancy. Okay, our healthcare standards are very high. Number of working hours, we can also talk about that. So all this is not provided in table 1. Again, because the difference between the GDP per capita is actually really small. That's the reason why you have to go and look at all the other indicators. If the GDP per capita was bigger, maybe you have, I think the data is actually sufficient already. Okay, so again, for a 10-mark question, you make the main argument, the antithesis the other argument, because it's assess whether, and then finally, because it's a 10-mark question, you come up with a conclusion.